The city thrives in shadows, where power is bought, justice is twisted, and those who stand in the way are silenced. For young attorney Elena Carter, the law was supposed to be a shield, a tool for truth. But when she takes on what seems like an impossible case, she stumbles upon something far bigger than a single man's innocence, a rigged system, a corrupt judge, a real estate mogul who plays by his own rules. What begins as a routine defense spirals into a fight for survival. Evidence disappears, witnesses vanish, threats turn real. And soon, Elena isn't just fighting for her client, she's fighting to stay alive. But some battles are worth the risk. Some truths refuse to stay buried. This isn't just about justice. It's about exposing the ones who think they're untouchable. And Elena? She's just getting started. If you're ready for a story filled with power, corruption, and the fight for truth, then hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications. Stay with us as we dive deep into a case that should have been open and shut, but became a battle against the city's most dangerous players. Justice has a price, and Elena Carter is about to find out what it really costs. Don't miss a moment. Subscribe now. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Elena could feel the tension radiating from every corner of the courtroom. The murmurs had not faded. Instead, they grew louder, rolling like a tide of disbelief crashing against the walls. She could see it in their faces: confusion, outrage, suspicion. No one had expected this outcome, certainly not Justice Holloway. Her fingers tightened around William Archer's trembling hand, but she could barely register his gratitude. Her pulse roared in her ears. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, suffocating. This wasn't just a win, it was a challenge, a statement. And Judge Holloway wanted her to know exactly what it meant. Elena forced herself to meet his gaze. His eyes, sharp and calculating, bore into her with an unspoken warning. This was not over, not for him, not for her. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Every instinct screamed at her to get out, to disappear before the walls of this courtroom closed in. But something inside her refused to be cowed. She had fought for this. She had fought for Archer, for justice, for the truth. And now, standing in the aftermath, she could feel it. That this was bigger than one case, bigger than one man's freedom. Something was lurking beneath the surface, something dark, something powerful. She turned to Archer, nodding slightly. "Let's go." The moment she stepped forward, the room seemed to shift around her. The whispers followed her, some hushed, some biting. The opposing counsel stared, their mouths drawn tight, their eyes flashing with something close to contempt. Even the bailiff, who had stood stone-faced throughout the trial, gave her a look that made her skin prickle. She gripped her files and straightened her shoulders, keeping her steps measured as she walked past the judge's bench. The exit felt impossibly far. Each step felt like a test. The heavy doors loomed ahead, but before she could push them open, a voice stopped her. Low, almost inaudible, yet sharp enough to freeze her in place. "This was a mistake, Miss Carter." She turned her head just slightly. Judge Holloway hadn't moved, but his words lingered, deliberate. A chill crawled up her spine. Elena inhaled slowly, forcing herself to keep walking. The doors swung open, and the cool air of the hallway hit her like a shock. But even as she stepped into the world beyond that courtroom, she knew she wasn't free of it. Not yet. 6 weeks earlier, the world had felt much smaller. No packed courtroom, no furious judge, no suffocating weight of expectation. Just a dimly lit office with stacks of legal textbooks, a blinking laptop screen, and a silence so thick it threatened to swallow Elena whole. She rubbed her temples, staring at the latest reminder of her student loan balance. The numbers were daunting, a constant shadow over her future. She needed paying clients, desperately, but those weren't exactly lining up at her door. Her laptop chimed. A new email. Pro bono case, urgent. She hesitated. Pro bono meant no paycheck, and right now, she couldn't afford to waste time on charity. But something about the subject line, the urgency, made her click. William Archer. The name meant nothing to her. The charges, however, told a brutal story. Arson, insurance fraud, a diner burned to the ground, a desperate man backed into a corner. She scrolled through the attached files, her stomach tightening with each one. Surveillance footage showed a figure near the building moments before the fire erupted. Bank records showed William drowning in debt. Witness statements painted a picture of a broken man who had everything to lose. And then, there was a confession. The case was airtight, unwinnable. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad, ready to close the file, ready to move on. Then she saw his photo. William Archer was older than she expected, deep lines cut into his face, his eyes heavy with something deeper than exhaustion. Not fear, not guilt, grief. She exhaled, leaning back in her chair. Grief wasn't a defense. Grief didn't make someone innocent, but something in his expression, the hollow weight in his stare, made her pause. She picked up her phone and dialed the contact number listed in the file. A gruff voice answered. "Yeah? Mr. Archer? My name is Elena Carter. I was forwarded your case." A beat of silence, then a sigh, heavy and resigned. "Figured they'd send someone sooner or later. I'd like to meet with you." Another pause. "I don't have much to say that the cops haven't already twisted around." "Then tell me the truth." A dry chuckle. "You a believer in truth, Miss Carter?" She hesitated. "I believe in facts." Another pause. Then, "Meet me at the community center on 4th, tomorrow morning." The call ended. Elena stared at the screen, her heart thudding in her chest. She wasn't sure what she expected. Maybe another reminder that this was a waste of time. Instead, all she had was a question lingering in the back of her mind. What if he really didn't do it? The community center was nearly empty when Elena arrived the next morning. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting a dull glow over the worn-out chairs and coffee-stained tables. Across the room, sitting by the window, was William Archer. He looked smaller than she expected, wrapped in an old, weathered coat, his hands resting on a disposable coffee cup. When she approached, he barely glanced up, just motioned for her to sit. "You a gambler, Miss Carter?" he asked, voice rough like gravel. She frowned. "No." He let out a humorless chuckle. "Then what are you doing betting your career on a man no one believes?" Elena studied him. Everything about him, his voice, his posture, the way his fingers gripped that cup, felt wrong for a man who had burned down his own diner. Desperate men lie. Guilty men deflect. But Archer wasn't doing either. She opened her folder, laying out the documents. "The evidence against you is strong," she said. "Surveillance footage, financial records, even a statement." "Not a confession," he interrupted, his voice flat. "They twisted my words." Elena leaned in. "Then help me untwist them." Archer stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "That diner. My wife and I built it from nothing. She died 4 years ago, but that place, it was her dream. I'd burn before I burned it down." Something about the way he said it made Elena pause. People lie. But grief? Grief never does. Still, belief wasn't enough. She needed something concrete. Back in her office, she spent the rest of the day going through every second of the surveillance footage. It felt like staring at a puzzle with missing pieces. The fire started at 1:37 a.m. The suspect on screen, broad shoulders, heavy jacket, a purposeful stride, moved toward the back exit. She nearly dismissed it as just another piece of damning evidence. Until she saw the jacket. It was an old military division jacket, its faded emblem barely visible. She flipped through Archer's personal records. He had served in the military, yes, but his uniform had changed over the years. His own photos showed a newer insignia, a modern cut. Something didn't add up. The next morning, she called a military surplus manufacturer, posing as a buyer. "We haven't sold that model in over a decade," the rep on the other end said. Elena sat up straighter. "Are you sure?" "Positive. That style was discontinued after 2009. If someone's still wearing it, they've had it for a long time." She hung up, her pulse quickening. If that jacket was no longer in circulation, how could it have appeared in the footage? She pulled the case file back up, flipping through the evidence reports. The footage had been submitted by the insurance company, not the police. That wasn't standard procedure. Elena exhaled slowly. Had the footage been altered? If so, the real question wasn't just who had framed Archer. It was why. Elena sat across from Judge Raymond Holloway, her case files spread neatly on the bench before him. She had spent all night preparing, making sure every detail was solid, every argument airtight. "The footage is flawed," she stated, her voice steady. "The jacket the suspect is wearing hasn't been manufactured in over a decade. That means the timestamp on the footage could be altered. This evidence isn't as reliable as the prosecution is claiming." Holloway barely looked up from his papers. "Miss Carter," he sighed, "are you seriously suggesting that this court should disregard legitimate evidence because of a jacket?" She clenched her jaw. "It's not just the jacket. The footage came directly from the insurance company, not law enforcement. That alone raises questions." Holloway finally met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You're wasting this court's time." Elena felt a flicker of something cold run down her spine. The way he dismissed her, it wasn't the usual judicial impatience. There was something sharper beneath it. Before she could press further, he continued. "The evidence has been admitted. If you wish to challenge it, do so in trial, but I won't entertain baseless speculation in my courtroom." Baseless speculation. The words sat heavy in her chest as she gathered her files and left the office. This wasn't just about a legal argument, it was something else. Something personal. Judge Holloway wanted this case buried. She didn't know why, but she wasn't about to let it go. Back at her office, she scoured property records, legal disputes, any connection Archer's case might have to someone powerful. It took hours before she found it. Richard Gale. His name appeared in a zoning request for the land Archer's diner stood on, submitted just weeks before the fire. Elena's pulse quickened. Gale was a real estate developer with a reputation for getting what he wanted, by any means necessary. She had come across his name before, whispered in legal circles, attached to shady deals that somehow never made it to trial. And now, he was linked to Archer's case. If Archer went to prison, his property would go up for sale. And who had already put in a request for that land? Richard Gale. Elena sat back in her chair, staring at the name on her screen. This wasn't just about arson. This was about money, power, and control. But if Gale was pulling the strings, then Judge Holloway's reaction made even less sense. Why was he so intent on dismissing her? Unless he was part of it. She glanced at the clock. It was late, but she needed answers. She grabbed her coat, stuffing her notes into her bag. There had to be someone willing to talk, someone who knew what was really going on. Meanwhile, Archer sat alone in his holding cell, staring at the wall. His shoulders hunched, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. Elena's visits had brought him hope, at first. But hope was dangerous. He had been around long enough to know men like Richard Gale never lost. And if that was true, then neither of them would be walking away from this. The envelope was waiting for her when she arrived at her office. Plain, unmarked, tucked neatly under the door like a message only meant for her. Elena hesitated before picking it up. Something about it felt wrong. Not in the way threats felt wrong, but in the way secrets did. Someone wanted her to see this, but they didn't want to be known. She locked the door behind her, peeled open the flap, and slid the contents onto her desk. Photographs. Grainy, slightly blurred, taken from a distance, but still clear enough to show a man standing near Archer's diner on the night of the fire. Not Archer. Elena's breath caught. She flipped through them, her fingers moving faster with every image. Same man, different angles. One showed him near the back exit, another with his hands in his pockets, as if waiting for something. She checked the timestamp in the corner of one of the shots. 1:32 a.m. The fire had started at 1:37 a.m. This was it. This was proof that someone else had been there. Elena's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She needed to find out who this man was, but then she paused. Something wasn't right. The envelope had no sender, no note, no explanation. Who sent this? And why? She looked at the door as if expecting someone to be standing there, watching. But of course, there was no one. Whoever had given this to her wanted to help, but they were too afraid to do it openly. Elena exhaled, pushing down the unease creeping into her chest. No matter the reason, she couldn't ignore this. She grabbed the photos and her bag and headed for the door. If this man was the key to saving Archer, she had to find him before it was too late. Elena knew the moment she walked into the courtroom that it was going to be a war. The prosecution smirked as she took her seat, whispering among themselves. Judge Holloway barely acknowledged her presence, already flipping through his notes with disinterest. And when the trial began, it became clear that the deck had been stacked against her from the start. The prosecution wasted no time painting Archer as a desperate man with nothing left to lose. They replayed the altered footage, waved his financial records like a guilty verdict, and sneered at Elena's attempts to challenge their airtight case. When she finally stood to argue, the lead prosecutor leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Your Honor, I think we can all appreciate Miss Carter's enthusiasm, but this isn't law school. This is real court. And in the real world, speculation doesn't replace evidence." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Elena's grip tightened around the edge of the table. She kept her face still, her posture controlled. She wouldn't let them see her flinch. She turned to Holloway, hoping for a fair ruling. Instead, he sighed impatiently. "Miss Carter, unless you have something substantial, I suggest we move on. This court doesn't have time for baseless theories." Elena took a slow breath, willing her voice to stay steady. "Then let's make time for facts." She turned, nodded toward the back of the courtroom. The doors opened. A man stepped forward. Daniel Blake. Gasps rippled through the audience. The prosecutor's smirk vanished. Even Holloway's expression shifted for the first time all day. Elena spoke clearly, deliberately. "This is Daniel Blake, former security officer, and he was near Archer's diner the night of the fire." Blake took the stand, his hands twitching as he was sworn in. "I saw them," he said. His voice wavered at first, but then steadied. "Two men. They left the alley behind the diner minutes before the fire started. Neither of them was William Archer." The courtroom erupted. Judge Holloway slammed his gavel. "Order! I will have order!" But the damage was done. The jury's faces had changed. Doubt had crept in. The perfect narrative the prosecution had built was crumbling. Elena saw the moment they lost. It was when Blake said the final words that sealed the case. "I don't know who they were, but they weren't him." By the time the jury returned with the verdict, the tension in the room was suffocating. Not guilty. The words hit the courtroom like a shockwave. Archer inhaled sharply beside her, gripping her hand like a lifeline. Judge Holloway's expression darkened. He stared at her, unblinking. "You may have won, Miss Carter," he said slowly, voice barely above a whisper. "But this isn't over." Elena met his gaze, but a chill ran down her spine. Why was he taking this case so personally? Elena barely remembered the drive home. Her body ached, her mind still trapped in the courtroom, replaying every word, every glance, every moment Judge Holloway had tried to crush her under the weight of his authority. She had won. She should feel victorious. but instead, an unease settled deep in her bones, a feeling she couldn't shake no matter how many times she reminded herself that Archer was finally free. The night air was crisp as she stepped out of her car, her breath visible in the glow of the streetlights. The quiet should have been comforting, but as she reached her apartment door, something was off. The door. It was open, just slightly, a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. She stopped, her pulse spiking. Did I forget to lock it? Number. She never forgot. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to leave, to call someone. But she forced herself forward, nudging the door open with her fingertips. The apartment was silent. Too silent. She stepped inside carefully, her eyes scanning the room. Everything looked normal. Her couch, her books, the half-empty coffee cup she had left that morning. Nothing was overturned, no shattered glass, no signs of struggle. But something was wrong. Her desk, her files, they were gone. Every document, every note, every piece of evidence she had collected on Archer's case, vanished. The folders she had left stacked by her laptop the night before were missing. The laptop itself was still there, untouched. They hadn't come for valuables. They had come for information. She felt the blood drain from her face. Elena backed away, her breath shallow. Her hands fumbled for her phone as she dialed, pressing it to her ear with shaking fingers. 911? What's your emergency? My apartment. Her voice felt distant, detached from the rest of her. Someone was here. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights filled the street outside her building. 2 officers walked through her apartment, their radios crackling in the background. No forced entry? One of them muttered. No sign of a break-in. Elena stood near the door, arms crossed over her chest, trying to still the tremor in her hands. Maybe you just forgot to lock it, the other officer suggested. Her stomach twisted. No, she said firmly. I always lock it. The officer shrugged. If nothing's missing except some papers, it's probably nothing. Probably nothing. She didn't argue. She didn't have the energy. But as they took their notes and left, the weight in her chest only grew heavier. Whoever had been here hadn't wanted money. They had wanted to erase something. And if they were willing to break into her home to do it, the game wasn't over. It was just beginning. Sleep didn't come that night. Elena sat at her desk, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, but her mind refused to slow. Who had been in her apartment? Who had taken the files? And more importantly, why now? It wasn't just about Archer anymore. The case was closed. The verdict had been delivered. So why was someone still trying to bury it? She tapped her fingers against her desk, staring at her laptop screen. Who had access to the evidence? Who would have benefited if Archer had been convicted? Her gut kept pulling her back to Richard Gale. The man was a real estate giant, a name whispered in legal circles, always attached to lucrative deals that seemed to appear out of thin air. She had already suspected his involvement, but until now, there had been no proof. She opened the city's property records, scanning through recent transactions. Nothing under Gale's name. That wasn't surprising. A man like him wouldn't leave a paper trail. She dug deeper. Zoning requests, development proposals, anything that could tie him to Archer's diner. And then, she found it. A zoning application filed just days before the fire. Her stomach tightened. The document outlined a redevelopment plan for the exact lot where Archer's diner once stood. If Archer had gone to prison, his property would have been seized and auctioned. And the buyer? A shell company registered under a law firm, one that had handled multiple cases for Richard Gale in the past. She exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers to her temple. Archer's arrest wasn't just about insurance fraud, it was about money. Gale had planned to buy the land for next to nothing, flip it, and triple his profits. But that wasn't the part that made her stomach drop. The document had been approved by the court. And the judge who had signed off on it? Judge Raymond Holloway. Elena leaned back in her chair, the realization crashing over her. Holloway hadn't just been biased. He was part of it. That's why he dismissed her claims. Why he had shut her down in court. Why he had seemed almost angry when she won. She hadn't just won a case. She had disrupted something powerful, the missing files, the break-in, the way Holloway had warned her in court. They weren't trying to erase Archer's case, they were trying to erase her. Elena stared at the zoning document, her mind racing. This was it, the proof. Holloway and Gale had been working together, orchestrating Archer's downfall to clear the way for a multi-million-dollar land grab, and she had just exposed them. She should have felt victorious. Instead, her chest tightened with unease. They had already broken into her apartment. What would they do now? Her fingers hovered over her phone. She needed to get this out, to the press, to the Bar Association, to anyone who could blow this wide open. But just as she reached for her laptop, her phone vibrated. Unknown caller. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she answered. For a second, there was only silence. A deep, hollow kind. Then a voice, low, steady, measured. You don't know what you're dealing with, Miss Carter. Elena's throat went dry. Walk away. She didn't speak. She didn't move. You think this is about one case? One man? You have no idea how deep this goes. The line clicked dead. Elena sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. Her hands trembled as she set it down. The silence in her apartment suddenly felt suffocating. This wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Her mind replayed the words. You have no idea how deep this goes. She had thought she was pulling at a loose thread. But what if she had unraveled something much bigger? What if she wasn't just going after Holloway and Gale? What if there were more? Elena swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. She wasn't sure what terrified her more, the warning itself, or the fact that she wasn't even considering walking away. Elena didn't waste time. The moment the call ended, she grabbed her coat and keys, her hands still shaking as she rushed out the door. She needed Daniel Blake. He was the only living witness who had seen what really happened the night of the fire. Without him, her case fell apart. Her car sped through the quiet streets, the city lights blurring past. The warning still echoed in her ears. Walk away. But she wasn't walking away. Blake's apartment building was in a rundown part of town. She had been here once before, just days ago when she convinced him to testify. His hesitation had been clear even then. He had been scared. And now, she was afraid that fear had caught up to him. She parked outside and climbed the creaky stairs 2 at a time. His door was shut, but something felt wrong. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Harder. Nothing. A door creaked open down the hall and an older man peered out. His lined face was wary, his eyes cautious as they settled on her. You looking for Blake? He asked, voice rough from years of smoking. Elena turned to him, her pulse quickening. Yes. Do you know where he is? The man shook his head. 2 men came looking for him yesterday. Big guys. Looked official, but they weren't cops. I saw him knock, then they left. After that, he shrugged. Blake packed up his stuff, took off. Haven't seen him since. Elena's breath caught. They got to him. She gripped the railing to steady herself, her mind racing. Where would he go? Who would he turn to? Did he say anything before he left? She pressed. The man hesitated, then nodded. He told me I should have kept my mouth shut. A cold wave of dread settled over her. She was running out of time. Blake was gone, and whoever had scared him off wasn't going to stop there. She thanked the man quickly and walked back to her car, her thoughts spiraling. Blake was the only witness who could tie this to Holloway and Gale. And now, he had vanished. She gripped the steering wheel, staring out at the dark streets. Who else could she trust? The answer came almost instantly. No one. Elena sat in her car outside Linden Cafe, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. This was her last card. No witness, no protection, no time. If they wanted to erase her, they wouldn't hesitate. And if she was going down, she wasn't going down quietly. She had spent the past hour debating whether to make the call. Megan Hall was one of the few journalists who still believed in real investigative work. She had exposed corrupt cops, corporate fraud, and even taken on city officials before. But this was bigger. Elena exhaled sharply, then dialed. Megan answered on the second ring. "Elena Carter," she said, her voice edged with curiosity. "Didn't think I'd be hearing from you." "I need to talk," Elena said, keeping her voice steady. "It's about Judge Holloway, Richard Gale, and a case they tried to bury." A pause. "Elena, if you're calling me, that means you've already stirred up something dangerous." "I don't have a choice," she admitted. "They've already broken into my place. My key witness is missing, and I just got a call telling me to walk away." Megan's voice hardened. "You in trouble?" "Not yet," Elena lied. "But I might be soon." Another pause. Then, "Where?" Elena glanced out the window. She couldn't risk her office, couldn't risk anywhere private. "Public," she said. "Somewhere busy. Linden Cafe, an hour." Megan hesitated. "If you're lying low, why not somewhere quieter?" Elena swallowed. "Because I need people around me." Megan understood immediately. If something happened, someone would see. "I'll be there," she said. Elena hung up, her pulse hammering. She stepped out of her car and into the cafe, choosing a booth near the window. The place was alive with movement, baristas shouting orders, customers chatting over coffee, silverware clinking against plates. It was the kind of noise that made people invisible. And right now, invisibility was survival. She ordered a coffee she wouldn't drink and set her phone on the table, watching the door. Minutes passed. Then, her skin prickled. A black SUV pulled up outside. It wasn't parked. It was waiting. Elena's breath hitched. "They found me." Elena's fingers hovered over her phone, her pulse hammering as she reread the message. "Meet me at the docks at midnight." No cops, no press. Daniel Blake. He was alive. Or this was a trap. She exhaled sharply, her mind racing. Blake had run. He had been terrified. Why would he reach out now? Why at midnight? And why the docks, somewhere isolated, where no one could hear a gunshot? She glanced out the window. The black SUV was still there, idling. She had two choices: ignore the message and stay hidden, or take the risk and get the truth. She made her choice. The docks were quiet. Too quiet. Elena stepped carefully over the cracked pavement, her breath visible in the cold night air. The scent of salt and oil lingered, mixing with the distant hum of the city beyond the water. She kept her hands in her coat pockets, gripping the pepper spray she had brought. Not much of a defense against a gun, but she had to be ready. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Blake. "You alone?" She swallowed hard before typing back. "Yes." A few seconds passed. Then, footsteps. Blake emerged from the shadows. His hood was pulled low over his face, his hands stuffed into his jacket. He looked over his shoulder twice before stepping toward her. "You came," he muttered. "You called me," she shot back. "Why?" His jaw tightened. He hesitated, eyes darting toward the water. Something was wrong. Elena took a slow step back. "Daniel, what's going on?" Then she heard it. More footsteps. Two figures emerged from the darkness, their movements slow, deliberate. Elena's stomach dropped. Judge Holloway. Richard Gale. Holloway's expression was cold, unreadable. Gale, on the other hand, was smiling. "You should have quit while you had the chance, Miss Carter," Holloway said. Elena's breath came sharp and shallow. She turned to run. Too late. A gun clicked behind her. She froze. The metallic barrel pressed against the back of her ribs, firm and unshaking. A deep voice, one she didn't recognize, spoke close to her ear. Move, and you die. Elena's pulse roared in her ears. The cold press of the gun against her ribs was unrelenting, and she could feel the tension in the man behind her, waiting, ready to end this in an instant. Holloway took a slow step forward, his eyes gleaming under the dim dock lights. Gale stood beside him, hands in his coat pockets, calm as ever. "You should have listened to the warning," Holloway muttered. Elena's hands clenched into fists. If they thought she was going to beg, they didn't know her at all. Gale smirked. "It's nothing personal, Carter. You were just too damn stubborn for your own good." Elena swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth. This was it. The gunman behind her adjusted his stance. Her body tensed. Then, a deafening wail shattered the silence. Sirens, then, floodlights. Blinding white beams exploded across the docks, swallowing everything in their path. Shadows stretched long, and chaos erupted. "FBI, drop your weapons!" Elena barely had time to process before the dock was swarmed. Black SUVs screeched to a halt, agents in tactical gear moving fast, weapons drawn. The man behind her hesitated. It was all she needed. Elena lunged sideways, throwing herself to the ground just as the agents took their positions. "On the ground! Now!" Gale bolted, but 3 agents tackled him to the pavement within seconds. Holloway barely moved, standing stiff as a stone. The gunman who had held Elena at gunpoint raised his hands, slowly lowering the weapon to the ground. Elena gasped for air, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she pushed herself onto her elbows. A shadow loomed over her. Megan Hall. The journalist crouched beside her, gripping her shoulder. "Told you I don't like being left out." Elena coughed out a laugh. She had sent Megan the address before she left. Just in case. She forced herself to her feet, swaying slightly as she turned to where the agents were pulling Holloway's hands behind his back, snapping metal cuffs around his wrists. The judge's jaw was tight, his lips pressed into a thin, furious line. Elena stepped forward, her heartbeat steadying as she met his cold stare. She tilted her head. "Looks like you dismissed the wrong person, Your Honor." For the first time since she had met him, Judge Holloway had nothing to say. The headlines exploded across every major news outlet the next morning. Judge Holloway arrested in corruption scandal. Real estate mogul Richard Gale in FBI custody. Illegal land deals exposed. Young lawyer Elena Carter takes down city's most powerful players. Elena sat at her desk, flipping through the articles, but the words felt distant. This should have felt like victory. William Archer was a free man. His name was cleared, his record wiped clean. He had walked out of that courthouse with tears in his eyes, thanking her over and over again. And yet, the cost had been steep. Daniel Blake never testified. He disappeared, gone without a trace, no forwarding address, no messages, nothing. She had tried to find him, called every number she had, searched every place she thought he might hide, but he was gone. And maybe, after everything, she couldn't blame him. He had been right to be afraid. She exhaled slowly, turning to the window. The city stretched out before her, glowing under the weight of neon lights and endless movement. Somewhere out there, people were celebrating this win. Others were scrambling to cover their tracks, watching their backs, wondering if they were next. Because this wasn't just about Holloway and Gale. They were only the beginning. Elena knew how this worked now. For every corrupt official taken down, another was waiting to take their place. And yet, despite everything, the threats, the fear, the cost, she wasn't done. She couldn't be done. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing the exhaustion from her temples. This fight wasn't over. It never would be. But at least now, they knew her name, and she was ready for the next fight. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping legal dramas, high-stakes investigations, and stories of justice against all odds, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's always another case, another mystery, and another fight for the truth. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button now.